This is the cover, actually. That cover image appears on my book. It's an image that I really warm to. It's by probably the most prolific of New Zealand's war artists from the First World War, one George Butler. And he actually painted and asked the soldier to pose for this image, and that soldier is Corporal John Walter Carl. He's a farmer from Winton, and he's 25 years old when that painting is done, although I think he looks slightly older than that. I was curious about this man, and I actually pulled his file, and they're all available online. I pulled his file, and I noticed that in actually 1917 he'd been a sergeant, and so now he's a corporal, so he's been demoted, and I wonder what the story was there. One day I might go actually and have a look at that, because I'm sure it's worth following. It wasn't in his file, by the way. Now, this paper emerges, as has already been said, from the work that I've done for a volume on the centenary history of New Zealand in the First World War. The volume that I've done is a different piece of military history from what I've done before, in that it is a social history as much as a military history, and it aims to paint a comprehensive picture of the New Zealand soldier, what they experienced, why they enlisted, what their motives were, what they thought about the enemy, and so forth. And I have to say I was very well served, because I used as a model this book here by Richard Holmes, by the late Professor Richard Holmes, and he, in his book Tommy, the British Soldier on the Western Front, did exactly what I wanted to do for the New Zealand soldier. And if anybody wants to know what it was like for the ordinary soldier on the Western Front, the ordinary Tommy, this book is unsurpassed. Sir Max Hastings, who is no mean historian himself, reviewed it in the Daily Mail, and he said that it was indispensable for anybody who wants to understand what the life of the soldier on the Western Front was like. Among the many virtues of the book, Richard Holmes employs a wonderful range of unfamiliar voices and sources, and that's exactly what I wanted to do with the book Johnny Enzed. And as you've heard, I actually managed to get hold of over 2,000 letters, diaries, unpublished manuscripts, published manuscripts, and so forth, hoping to that some of these unfamiliar voices could be heard for the first time, and also that we could look, and this is the aim of the centenary history, look at this event with new eyes, to really try and understand this pivotal conflict and how it shaped the New Zealanders who went. One of the themes that emerged from the book, and hopefully will be seen in this presentation, is that we actually need to be a little, take more care when we make broad generalisations about the New Zealand soldiers of that war. The experience of those men was wide-ranging, and they often reacted to those experiences in vastly different ways. Not all 100,000 plus New Zealanders who served in that war thought about their shared experiences in an identical way. And recently, Professor Hugh Strawn, who's probably Britain's foremost expert on the First World War, actually threw this challenge out. And he said the challenge for media, broadcasters, publishers, academics, national governments, and so forth will be to escape the cliches of the 50th anniversary in order to shape a new set of popular narratives. Those cliches include the notion that they were lions led by donkeys, that every soldier, spent months on end in trenches, and that it was a horrific, futile experience. We need to actually reshape that with some new narratives based on the evidence. There's certainly much truth in cliches, but they do need to be tested. They do need to be examined. They actually hide as much as they reveal at times, and the centenary of the First World War is the ideal time to do that. This is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about the terminology, why I chose Johnny Enzed and not Kiwi soldiers at war. Going to look at this notion in August 1914, was there this war enthusiasm which has been the accepted historiography up till now. I'll look at motives for enlisting, and they were actually many and varied. I'm then going to do a type of statistical analysis as to who was the average Johnny Enzed. Was he a labourer? Did he come from a rural background? Was he from the working class, as some of the Labour newspapers alleged? I'll also put up some statistics to show that New Zealand war effort was absolutely massive and is probably even larger than we actually anticipated. We'll look at the first impressions that New Zealanders made on their allies, and I have to say they weren't favourable, and you'll see that. And then I will try and get the soldiers to the shores of Gallipoli should time permit, and we will see how we go. So the terminology, why Johnny NZ? I've showed you Richard Holmes's book Tommy, and during the First World War, Tommy became the general accepted name. It had a origin going back to the Napoleonic Wars actually, but it became generally accepted as the use for the average British soldier, even though it was unpopular with commanders and some soldiers. Some commanders tried to stamp it out, and this is what one Conference of Divisional Commanders decreed in October 1915. That is, not to use the word Tommy, it's absolutely barred. Unfortunately, you cannot order a language out of existence. Good regiments or not, the word Tommy continued to be used to denote British troops throughout the war. Not all British soldiers welcomed the term, although it wasn't universally despised as the French term poilu. That was the name given to them, which literally translates as hairy ones, which is probably why they didn't like it very much. Some British soldiers felt the term Tommy to be patronising in its origins, and it particularly grated with Welsh, Irish and Scottish soldiers. Now, the term Tommy was never used by Anzac soldiers, by Australians or New Zealanders, except on the home front. The home front people did use the word Tommy, and they sometimes abbreviated, as you can see from these cartoons from the Freelance, to Private Tommy Anzac. I have to say that the New Zealanders and the Australians would have hated to be called Tommies for several reasons. They were establishing their own national identity, and little known to some of these people, the word Tommy already existed in New Zealand. It was slang for a crooked bookmaker on a race course. So no wonder they did not want to be called Tommies. They came up with many terms to refer to themselves, and these are the terms that they call themselves: Anzac or Digger, Enzed, Fern Leaf, Marilander, Moalander, Pig Islander and so forth. The first two terms I tend to avoid because they are contested, and we know what the Australians are like. They always try and claim the good things like Pavlova and Farlap and so on. They claim those terms as well. Surprisingly, the term Kiwi was rarely used. In fact, amongst those 2,000 plus letters and diaries, I found 3 uses of the term, and 2 of them were actually used in a derogatory sense. They were used as an insult. It's quite hard to believe that these ready and rough soldiers would refer to themselves as fern leaves, but they did, and it's really surprising. I'm going to give you an account of a New Zealand soldier, Raymond Baker, who's at Chunuk Bair, gets badly wounded, has to crawl down from the slopes down to the beach, and because the medical arrangements have gone to pot, he lies there wounded, bleeding for 3 days. And he is only saved by the fact that he is wearing a fern leaf badge and another soldier recognises it. And this is the account from his diary. He said, we had to wear identity discs, but in addition I wore a little silver fern with the word with NZ stamped on it. So he was lying down on the beach when 2 Australian stretcher bearers went past and they saw him. And notice the terminology. Hello, Pig Islander, which is the colloquial for New Zealand. Didn't say hello Kiwi, no, hello Pig Islander. He said, yes, how long have you been out here? It's 3 days since I've been wounded. Okay, so the 2 Aussie stretcher bearers, they load this guy up. They ignore the British commands to stop, where you going, get to the back of the line, and they dump him on one of the lighters, which takes him out to a hospital ship for treatment. And that probably saved his life, the fact that he's wearing a badge which is easily recognisable. Another common term which was applied to New Zealanders is this NZ, and according to Harry Orsman in the Dictionary of New Zealand Terminology, it has its origins in the First World War, and this is how he explains it. NZ, a New Zealander, specifically in World War I, a New Zealander. It is a term that no other country like Australia can appropriate. So that is why I have used it in my book. So that's how they refer to themselves. Now I have to say too that it became quite common. These are 2 publications put out in the Second World War. They quite like referring themselves as Johnny NZ. This is the New Zealanders in Italy and the New Zealanders in the Middle East, but they call themselves Johnny NZ. Now Johnny had been long used from about the middle of the 19th century. It meant a person, sometimes in a contemptuous way, although it could also be an affectionate way, and that is why I have called the book Johnny Enzed and referred to these soldiers throughout as Johnny Enzeds, because they're terminologies and language that they would have identified with. So I'll now move on, and having covered some of the terminology, and talk about this notion of war enthusiasm in New Zealand. At 3 p.m. in the afternoon of the 5th of August 1914, the Governor of New Zealand, Lord Liverpool, read a telegram on the steps of the Parliament advising that a state of war existed between the British and German empires. And here you have him reading the telegram with Massey and Ward on either side of him, looking rather solemn and sad. There was a crowd of 15,000 people there to hear this declaration, and once it had been read out, they burst into song, and they sang the national anthem, which at that time obviously was God Save the King, and then they sang Britannia, Rule Britannia, which is another patriotic, stirring song. This has become an enduring image of our entry into the war. As one historian has commented, and I'm quoting from Christopher Pugsley's books, New Zealanders celebrated on the streets that they were happily at war. One young New Zealander, Ormond Burton, caught the mood, and he wrote this in his account of what was happening at the time. There was enthusiasm and a haze of rather splendid feeling. A great adventure was opening up, and all the humdrum of life suddenly fell away, and men were like young gods in this new world of romance. Now, Thomas Seddon, who I'm going to refer to later on when he enlists, was a parliamentarian at the time, the son of the longest serving Prime Minister Richard Seddon. And he noted in his biography of the Seddon family that all party bickering ceased, and with a will, Parliament set to work to help the mother country in its hour of need. There was this wave of patriotic fervour which swept from the seat of government throughout the land. But it must be recognised, and it has been relatively recently, that not all New Zealanders welcomed the news of war against Germany. Not all felt that patriotic fervour described by Thomas Seddon, Ormond Burton, Cecil Malthus and so many others. The notion that all New Zealanders were submerged in a great wave of war enthusiasm in the first week of August 1914 has recently been challenged by some historians. And they present compelling evidence to show that not everybody in New Zealand was enthusiastic about the outbreak of war, and that some groups indeed absolutely opposed it. And those groups that opposed it included New Zealanders of German or Austrian descent, some women's organisations, pacifist organisations, conscientious objectives, opponents of compulsory military training, Maori in the Waikato, Taranaki and Urewera districts, and individual artists and intellectuals like Francis Hodgkin or Edward Tregear. As Graham Hucker, the late Graham Hucker noted, and he did most of the work on this, the views of those groups suggest that New Zealand society could not have been unanimous in greeting the war with enthusiasm in 1914. And even one of the semi-official histories acknowledged that many New Zealanders did not welcome the news of war in 1914. The little known and little read history of the Samoan Expeditionary Force actually says this: some who heard the news cheered, but there were some who heard those ominous words spoken by the Earl of Liverpool and on that fateful day, and had very real premonitions of the tortures of mind and the terrible losses coming ahead. William McKeon, who wrote a fantastic book that he had to publish himself, and a very, very great illustrator because he's an architect, said this. He noted in his memoirs on the outbreak of war, the news was received somewhat solemnly, and that there was little excitement when the New Zealand government announced the declaration of war. And he recalls that when the ship sailed, there were women and even men weeping on the streets. Now, one New Zealand historian has said that the sailing of the main body was like the departure of a rugby team for an international rugby tour. I don't think we have much weeping on the streets when those teams go away. Perhaps we do when they come back and they've lost, but not when they go away. So there is ample evidence of that there was widespread war enthusiasm. That has to be taken with a degree of scepticism. That cannot be taken as reflecting the general feelings of the population. Hugh Strawn has written of the United Kingdom that their response to the outbreak of war, that enthusiasm, and I'm quoting from his book, was a conspicuous froth, the surface element only, and that a passive resistance and a willingness to do one's duty was the most common response. And I think that probably occurred in New Zealand too. Ian McGibbon, I think, sums it up reasonably well. It's difficult to judge how many were ambivalent or even hostile, and there certainly were people of that ilk, but their voices were drowned out in the weeks that followed. There is little doubt that a substantial majority supported New Zealand taking a full and active part in the war. And within a week of that declaration of war, some 14,000 young men had come forward to volunteer their services. I have to say 35% of them were rejected on the state of their dental health, but that's another story, and that's in my book as well. Why did so many come forward to enlist? The reason that most history books give is that they were off on the great adventure, and there were certainly some who thought like that. David Mansfield, for example, enlisted at 9 o'clock on the day after war was declared. And 60 years later, when he was asked why he did it, he said this: "I don't think it was a matter of any thought of the country or anything like that. I think it was the thought of the great adventure that it was going to be." So there were certainly people who saw it as a great adventure. Then there were the prospects of overseas travel. And I love this recruiting advertisement. Travel the world with your machine gun. Okay. Join the machine gun corps and see the world. Now travel, tourism had become, travel used to be seen as an arduous task, particularly in the middle of the 19th century. But in the early 20th century it had become a luxury and had become commodified with travel agents and so on. But it was only available to the well-off, to those who had saved and were able to afford the expense of going overseas. Cecil Malthus, who was a young student, would not have had that opportunity, and he says this: "The prospect of seeing service gave us a thrill of pure joy, and indeed the feeling throughout New Zealand was one of pleasurable excitement. It was a unique opportunity to see something of the world overseas, although I believe patriotic motives were by no means lacking." And then we have some very young men who want to go off and see the world. The 16-year-old Norman Maxwell enlisted without difficulty in 1914 because, and I'm quoting from an interview he gave later on, the idea was a little bit of excitement and to see the world. And Kenneth Stevens enlisted the day after, once again 9 o'clock in the morning, from a sense of adventure and a chance to travel. He said, "The most important reason for me was that my enlistment, and I'm quoting from his interview transcript, was a cheap way to see the world." That is what he wanted to do. 50 years later, when William Angus was asked why he enlisted so soon, he said this: "To get away overseas, we thought we would go immediately." So we have those two, I guess you'd call them selfish motives, to great adventure, off to see the world, but there was also a notion of empire loyalty, which cannot be denied. Dan Curran, who was an office worker in Wanganui, recalled several motives why New Zealanders rushed to the colours. And he said it was a mixture of patriotism and adventure. He'd always been interested in deeds that won the empire, and he wanted to take part in it. Patriotism has often been overlooked as a strong motivating factor. George Tuck, for example, was working in his family firm in Wanganui, had no previous military training, so he thought he'd be left out, and he wrote a letter to his father, who was then overseas, and he says this: "I'm in such a state of suppressed excitement I can hardly write or spell. The horror of such a war is thrust temporarily into the background by one's patriotism. As heat cures a burn and snow cures frostbite, so the knowledge that Britain is at war for a moment cures the nausea of the whole thing. A sense of patriotism was a strong motivator for even the most unlikely people. Fred Rogers, who was a country bumpkin from Invercargill, his own words, 60 years later described why he enlisted, and he says this: "My reason for enlisting was to fight for my king and country and loved ones. I was always conscientious and willing to obey, which was the first duty of a soldier." Then James Marist, who is a miner from the west coast, says this: I had a grounding in empire loyalty, that the empire was worth defending if the need arose. It was something that just came to me, it grew, and he enlisted in the Canterbury Mounted Rifles James Rudd, when enlisting in the Canterbury Mounted Rifles, said something very similar. We honestly thought at the time it was our duty to go. And Frank Cooper, who enlisted from Christchurch, also recorded something of the patriotic motives, and he extended that to his family, and this is what he said. He's making a start on the great expedition which will do our duty for our home and country. And he says, of course, mum and sisters bearing up and as true Britons in the finest quality. So patriotism was certainly a strong motivating factor. Then there is this notion of family obligation. For some, it was felt that their family required them to enlist. Don Stacey, who was the youngest member of his family, said that as the baby of the family, he thought it was his job to go. Alfred Jennings made a similar comment. He said, "We're frightened of being left out. I came from a military family. We couldn't get there quick enough." And Alfred Smith, whose grandfather had fought at Waterloo, and had said, "Our family had always been in the army, and I felt compelled that it was my turn to go." Then there is the famous case of the Seddon family, this political family, I guess the equivalent of the Kennedys at the early 19th century. The three sons of the late Richard John Seddon, our longest serving Prime Minister, sat at breakfast the morning after the declaration of war was declared, and they talked in hushed tones because they didn't want their mother to overhear them, but all three boys had made the decision that they were going to enlist as soon as they possibly could. They need not have bothered to speak in whispers because their mother, Louisa Seddon, entered the dining room and she spoke one sentence to them, and she said this: "We're at war, I expect you all to go." So this is part of this family obligation. I got to say, that statement cost her an incredible amount, and you see the cost of war in the Seddon family. There are the three Seddon boys. That is Richard Junior Seddon, some bit of a checkered reputation, seemed to like helping himself to regimental funds when he could, but you know, that's by the by. He was killed in the Battle of Bay Porm in August 1918. The one on the far right is Tom Seddon, who returned to New Zealand as a decorated war hero. The youngest boy down the bottom here is Stuart Seddon, who enlisted when he was 17 years old, went to Samoa, got discharged, served in a British artillery unit, and at the end of the war was suffering so badly from post-traumatic stress disorder, he spent the rest of his life under psychiatric care in the UK. So he never came back to New Zealand. And when Tom Seddon arrived back to the wharves in Wellington, he saw this shriveled old lady dressed in black, and he didn't recognise his own mother because the war had taken such a toll on this family. So, family obligation. Then there are people, and we need to recognise this, there are people who could not actually say why they enlisted, which I would label as no reason or idle curiosity. William Bell was one. He said he enlisted to see what was doing. That's all you can say about it. And Norman Fleming, who joined the New Zealand Medical Corps, said, "I enlisted just because I wanted something to do." Now, Alfred Blanks and a friend went down to the recruiting depot to see what all the fuss was about and to watch, and I'm quoting from his interview transcript, and went down to watch what those silly buggers were enlisting for. But before he knew it, and obviously caught up in the moment, both Blanks and his friend had enlisted too and joined the ranks of the silly buggers. So, and he couldn't explain later why he did that. And so there are a whole lot of reasons why 8,500 men rushed to join the main body, and why a further 80,000 Johnny NZs would voluntarily enlist to fight in the war. There's popular war enthusiasm, the inherent optimism that they're off on a great adventure, the chance to travel. They were certainly key motivators, but so were things like patriotism, family obligations, and some people who had no reason for enlisting. As the war went on, of course, considerable social pressure was applied to them. So who were these men? The main body men, the statistics show that 74% of them were born in New Zealand. They were overwhelmingly single at 94%, and they were young men. Some 63% of the main body were under the age of 25, and with 40 of and those 40 numbered just 89, those who were 40 and over. In terms of religion, 86% professed to be Protestants, and they came from all classes and occupation. Now there is this a little bit of a myth which is quite strong in historical circles, that the men who fought at Gallipoli were all young men of 17 to about 21, and that the popular mythology would have that is the case. But not all were in their teens or had just reached 20. Death is no respecter of age, and we've been able to plot all those who died on Gallipoli and plot their age, and I've put them on a bar graph which shows the actual fact that age is a little bit older than we thought. There's a huge age span. The youngest person killed at Gallipoli was two 17-year-old boys, one who came from Opiki just up the road out of Palmerston North, one Martin Pearson. The oldest was 57, Chaplain Grant. So there's a 40-year spread, but you can see the median is 25 and the mean or average is just over 26 years. So they were not teens or young boys, they were certainly in their early 20s. What were their occupations? Now, General Hamilton, when he visited here and inspected the territorial force, he wrote back in a private letter, said that they were countrymen, and quote, they had far greater individuality and intelligence than the yokels of the old world, while they equalled them in physique, hardihood and nerve. So what he's saying is they're primarily rural countrymen, and that they would make great soldiers. There was certainly a rural flavour to the main body, primarily because it was recruited from all over New Zealand, and the large cities were only allowed to provide one company of 250 men. But as the war went on, they had to draw much wider in terms of occupation, class and social standing. And a return of occupations in mid-1917 indicates a remarkable diversity of occupations. They range from, and believe it or not, acrobats, we had 2, lawyers 161, rabbiters 44, tea tasters 5, medical practitioners 89, umbrella makers 1, and professional golfers 4, gunsmiths 4, case makers 1. But what I've done, there's a whole host of these, and they're about something like over 100 occupations. I've actually combined them into a table, and just to give you some idea about where the main ones come from, and worked out percentages. And what they show is a remarkable total. The trends are noticeable. Small tradesmen and professional men were quite high. Overwhelmingly, though, a large proportion of the NZEF came from occupations associated with the working class, including labourers, over 11,000 men, the second largest category of occupation. In fact, the labour unions were quite worried about how it was affecting their class of people. This is a famous cartoon from the Maryland Worker, which is saying that obviously everybody pointing at the worker that they need to go. And that's Mr Fat the capitalist, there's newspaper editors, there's clergy, there's the government represented by the Siamese twins, Massey and Ward, or the two-headed hydra as sometimes called, all pointing to the worker to go. Looking at some of the statistics, and I've given the figure there, around 50,000 of the total of 77,283 who were then in the NZEF came from the working class, just about 65% of the population, which is round about where you would expect it to be. What about rural occupations? In 1917, they were round about a third of all those who were enlisted, and here's some of the ones that were given. Certainly farmers, the largest category, 18,000 odd. And the total for rural people coming from rural bases is about 1/3, so, and 2/3 coming from cities and the larger towns. Now, something that is often overlooked is just how large the New Zealand war effort was, and you can see from these figures here that it was absolutely massive. In the census in 1911, it revealed that we had 248,666 men of military age. That is somewhere between the ages of 20 and 50. The late Graham Harker, who did most of the work on this, he excluded men who were over the age of 40. And if you exclude those, you take out the older people, we have 193,254 men to recruit from. The unfortunate fact is that many of those men were physically unfit. Medical rejections ran to almost 90,000. We were able to fix up their teeth, and that was only done by the dentist providing free treatment for soldiers that were enlisting, and by the fact that the New Zealand military became the first to set up its own dental corps. But then there are still 71,000, over 70,000, who are permanently unfit. That's categorised as C2 or D. C2 is unfit for service overseas. D is unfit for any type of military service at all. Then we have 91, over nearly 92,000 volunteering, another 32,000 being conscripted, making a total who served in the NZEF, called to the colours, at the end of 1918 of over 124,000 men. But it is even higher than that, because there were several thousand who served with the Australian Imperial Force, the numbers sitting at somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. Probably equal numbers in British forces if you include the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service. There are several hundred serving with the Canadians, and there are several hundred serving with the American Expeditionary Force, and there is a handful we've been able to find, believe it or not, serving with the French Foreign Legion, including one of their most decorated soldiers, a lieutenant colonel who wins the Croix de Guerre, gets the Croix de Guerre in 5 bars. That's an incredible achievement. Why was he serving in the French Foreign Legion? I think I have the answer. He had 2 wives. So that would be enough to enlist probably, but who knows. Yeah. Right, let me take these soldiers now to Gallipoli. I don't have time in this talk to cover the long sea journey or the training in Egypt, where 43,000 New Zealanders had their first experience of another culture, but they are chapters in the book.